The sun rose high in the sky, painting the small suburban neighborhood with a golden glow. It was shaping up to be one of those picture-perfect days. The Johnson family had spent the entire morning preparing for what promised to be an unforgettable birthday celebration. 8-year-old Mia bounced around the house like a little ball of energy, her pigtails swaying as she helped tie colorful balloons to the fence posts in the backyard. Her mom, Sarah, hummed softly while carefully frosting a unicorn-themed cake that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Balloons bobbed gently in the breeze and streamers fluttered above the picnic table, creating a festive atmosphere. Mia's grandparents had arrived earlier that day, their suitcases barely unpacked before they joined in the preparations. Grandma Helen bustled about, arranging plates of snacks and making sure everything was just right. Grandpa Joe, on the other hand, moved more slowly. He sat on the porch steps, his cane resting beside him, watching the commotion with a warm smile. His leg still ached from an old war injury, but he didn't let it dampen his spirits. Today was special. It was Mia's big day, and seeing her so happy made all the pain worth it. As guests began arriving, the house came alive with laughter and chatter. Kids ran through the yard, their giggles ringing out like music. Parents gathered near the grill, sipping lemonade and swapping stories. Even the neighbor's dog wandered over, wagging its tail as if it wanted to join the fun. Everything felt perfect, like something out of a storybook. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and barbecue smoke, and the warmth of the sun seemed to wrap everyone in a cozy embrace. But amidst all the excitement, no one noticed the quiet tension building in Grandpa Joe. He shifted slightly on the porch steps, wincing as his ribs reminded him of the past. Years ago, during his service in the military, he'd taken a hit that left lasting damage. Though he rarely talked about it, the memories lingered, tucked away like faded photographs in an old album. Still, today wasn't about him. It was about Mia. And as he watched her twirl in her bright pink dress, holding a sparkly wand like a true princess, he couldn't help but feel grateful for moments like these. What none of them realized, however, was that perfection can be fragile. Just as Mia prepared to blow out the candles on her cake, surrounded by cheering friends and family, a sharp knock echoed through the house. The sound cut through the cheerful buzz like scissors slicing through ribbon. Everyone froze mid-laugh, mid-cheer. Mark, Mia's dad, frowned and glanced toward the front door. Who could possibly be knocking now? Little did they know. This seemingly ordinary day was about to take a turn none of them would ever forget. For now, though, the moment hung suspended in time, like the flicker of candlelight waiting to be extinguished. The smiles were still there, the balloons still swayed in the breeze, and the sun still shone brightly overhead. But somewhere beyond the fence, unseen forces were gathering, ready to disrupt the harmony of this idyllic afternoon. The sharp knock at the door sent a ripple through the cheerful atmosphere like a stone dropped into a still pond. Mark hesitated for a moment, glancing at his wife, Sarah, who shrugged in confusion. Who could it be? No one had mentioned stopping by, and all their guests were already here, enjoying the party. Still, curiosity got the better of him, and he set down the spatula he'd been using to flip burgers before heading toward the front door. When he opened it, the sight that greeted him was unexpected and unsettling. 2 police officers stood on the porch, their uniforms crisp and their expressions stern. One of them held a clipboard, while the other rested a hand casually, but noticeably, on the grip of his holstered weapon. The contrast between their rigid demeanor and the lively scene behind them couldn't have been starker. Balloons swayed gently in the background, and faint laughter drifted from the backyard, but the mood shifted instantly under the weight of the officer's presence. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, trying to keep his tone polite despite the knot forming in his stomach. Something about this felt off. "We received reports of suspicious activity at this address," the taller officer said brusquely, not bothering to introduce himself or explain further. His voice carried an edge that made Mark's unease grow. "Suspicious? Activity?" Mark repeated, blinking in disbelief. "This is just a birthday party, my daughter's 8th birthday." He gestured toward the backyard where kids were chasing each other with water guns and parents chatted near the grill. "You're welcome to look around if you like, but I think you'll see there's nothing suspicious going on." Instead of responding, the officers exchanged a glance. The shorter one flipped open the clipboard and pretended to scan some notes, though Mark couldn't shake the feeling they weren't being entirely truthful. "We'll need to come inside," the taller officer insisted, taking a step forward as if to push past Mark. That's when things started to escalate. Mark instinctively moved to block their entry, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of calm. "Wait a second," he said firmly. "You can't just barge in without explaining what's going on. This is private property, and we're having a family event. If there's a misunderstanding, maybe we can clear it up right here." But the officers didn't seem interested in clearing anything up. Their faces hardened, and the tension thickened like storm clouds gathering overhead. Behind Mark, the sounds of celebration continued, oblivious to the brewing conflict at the front door. Someone shouted, "Make a wish, Mia," followed by applause as the candles on the cake were blown out. It was surreal, the joyous chaos of the party clashing sharply with the cold authority standing on the porch. Just then, Grandpa Joe appeared behind Mark, leaning heavily on his cane. His face was lined with concern, but his voice was steady. "What's going on here?" he asked, addressing both Mark and the officers. "Is everything okay?" The taller officer turned his attention to Grandpa Joe, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Sir, please stay back," he ordered, his tone clipped. But instead of retreating, Grandpa Joe took another slow step forward, wincing slightly as his injured leg protested the movement. "I live here," Grandpa Joe replied calmly, meeting the officer's gaze. "And I think we deserve an explanation before anyone comes inside." For a moment it seemed like the situation might de-escalate. The officers hesitated, perhaps realizing how unreasonable they sounded. But then the shorter officer muttered something under his breath and the taller one squared his shoulders, clearly determined to assert control. "This isn't a request," he said, pushing past Mark and stepping into the house. The sound of his boots against the hardwood floor felt jarring, intrusive. The party in the backyard carried on unaware, but inside, the air crackled with tension, setting the stage for what would soon become a day no one in the Johnson family, or the officers, would ever forget. The moment the officers stepped inside, the atmosphere in the house shifted like a storm cloud rolling over a sunny afternoon. Mark instinctively turned to follow them, his heart pounding as he tried to keep his voice steady. "Look," he said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "There's really no need for this. You can see it's just a family gathering. Kids, grandparents, nothing suspicious here." But the officers didn't seem interested in listening. They moved through the living room with an air of authority that felt more like intrusion than investigation. Their boots clicked loudly against the wooden floor, interrupting the faint hum of laughter and music drifting in from the backyard. The taller officer scanned the room with narrowed eyes while the shorter one muttered something into his radio about checking the perimeter. Grandpa Joe, still leaning on his cane, shuffled closer despite the pain in his leg. His presence commanded respect, even if the officers weren't willing to show it. "I don't understand what you're looking for," he said, his tone calm but firm. "We've done nothing wrong. This is my granddaughter's birthday party, and you're ruining it." The taller officer whipped around at the sound of Grandpa Joe's voice, his expression hardening. "Sir, I told you to stay back," he snapped, pointing a finger toward him. For a brief second there was silence, tense, heavy, and suffocating. Then, without warning, the officer took 2 quick steps forward, closing the distance between them. "Don't move!" The shorter officer barked suddenly, his hand moving to rest on the grip of his holstered weapon. The command came out sharp and loud, slicing through the tension like a knife. Everyone froze. Mark, Sarah, who had just appeared from the kitchen, and even Grandpa Joe. But the sudden shout startled Grandpa Joe more than anyone else. His already unsteady legs faltered under the weight of the demand, and he stumbled backward, trying to catch his balance. It happened too fast. Before anyone could react, the taller officer reached out, grabbing Grandpa Joe's arm to steady him, or so it seemed. But instead of helping, the grip was rough, almost violent. With a sharp push, the officer forced Grandpa Joe down onto the porch steps. The impact was jarring, Grandpa Joe let out a pained cry, clutching his side where old injuries lay buried, beneath years of scar tissue. His cane clattered to the ground beside him, useless now. Chaos erupted instantly. Sarah gasped, rushing to her father-in-law's side. "What are you doing? He's hurt!" she cried, her voice trembling with anger and fear. Mark stepped forward, his face red with fury. "Are you insane? He's an elderly man. What's wrong with you?" The guests in the backyard began to notice something was wrong. The cheerful chatter faded, replaced by murmurs of confusion. Someone peeked through the sliding glass door, catching sight of the commotion inside. Within moments, curious faces pressed against the windows, watching as the scene unfolded. Children stopped playing, their water guns forgotten on the grass. Parents exchanged worried glances, unsure whether to intervene or call for help. Through it all, Grandpa Joe sat hunched over on the steps, his breathing shallow and labored. Pain radiated through his ribs, reigniting memories of battles fought long ago. Yet even in his discomfort, he managed to lift his head and meet the officer's gaze. "You've made a mistake," he said quietly, his voice strained but steady. "A big one." For a split second, doubt flickered across the officers' faces. But they quickly masked it, doubling down on their defensive stance. "Stay seated," the taller officer growled, though his earlier bravado seemed to waver. Meanwhile, Mark knelt beside his father, trying to assess the damage while keeping himself between Grandpa Joe and the officers. In the chaos, no one noticed the figure standing silently across the street, observing every move. Retired Supreme Court Justice Evelyn Harper stood on her porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. The way the officers handled the situation, the panic spreading among the guests, and the unmistakable look of pain on Grandpa Joe's face. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Whoever these men thought they were dealing with, they had no idea what was coming next, and Justice Harper intended to make sure they regretted every decision they'd made today. Across the street, Justice Evelyn Harper stood on her porch, her posture rigid and her expression unreadable. Her sharp eyes darted between the officers' aggressive movements and the obvious distress of the Johnson family. She had seen enough. For someone who had spent decades ensuring justice was served in courtrooms across the country, this scene felt all too familiar and utterly unacceptable. Her mind raced as she processed what she was witnessing. The officers' behavior was reckless, disproportionate, and deeply troubling. They weren't conducting an investigation. They were escalating a situation that never should have existed in the first place. And then there was Grandpa Joe, elderly, clearly injured, and now visibly struggling after being shoved onto the porch steps. It wasn't just wrong, it was cruel. Justice Harper's gaze lingered on Grandpa Joe for a moment longer. There was something about him, a quiet dignity even, in pain that struck her. She couldn't shake the feeling that he carried stories from another time, battles fought not just on fields but within systems that often failed people like him. Whatever those stories were, she knew one thing for certain: no one deserved to be treated this way, especially not in their own home. With deliberate calm, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly over the screen, dialing a number she hadn't used in years. On the other end, a familiar voice answered almost immediately. "Evelyn? Is everything all right?" "No," she replied curtly, her tone leaving no room for small talk. "I'm looking at a situation right now that needs immediate attention. 2 officers are behaving recklessly at a residence across the street from me. I need you to get me in touch with someone who can handle this. Now." Ishik, person on the other end, hesitated briefly before responding. "Of course, let me make some calls. Do you want me to send backup?" "Yes," Justice Harper said firmly. "And make sure it's someone high-ranking. This isn't just a neighborhood dispute. It's a potential abuse of power, and I intend to see it addressed properly." She ended the call without waiting for further questions, her focus returning to the unfolding drama across the street. As she watched, the tension inside the house seemed to grow thicker by the second. Sarah knelt beside her father-in-law, trying to comfort him while keeping her anger in check. Mark stood protectively between the officers and his family, his jaw clenched tight. The guests hovered uncertainly near the backyard, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Children peeked out from behind trees and patio furniture, their earlier joy replaced by wide-eyed fear. Justice Harper's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't know the Johnsons personally. They were simply neighbors she occasionally waved to during evening walks. But she recognized the universal language of injustice when she saw it. What these officers were doing wasn't just harming one family. It was eroding trust in the very system meant to protect them. That thought alone fueled her determination to act. A black sedan turned onto the street moments later, pulling up smoothly to the curb. Out stepped a man in a neatly pressed suit, his badge glinting faintly in the sunlight. He scanned the scene, quickly before approaching Justice Harper, who nodded toward the house. "That's where it's happening," she said simply, her voice low but commanding. "Handle it carefully, but don't let them off easy." The man gave her a respectful nod before striding purposefully toward the chaos. As he disappeared through the front door, Justice Harper allowed herself a small sigh of relief, but only for a moment. She knew the real work was just beginning. Those officers might realize soon enough who had been watching them, but they wouldn't fully grasp the weight of their actions until much later. For now, she stayed on her porch, arms crossed, watching silently as events unfolded. Whoever those men thought they were dealing with, they'd underestimated the quiet power of a retired Supreme Court justice. And Justice Harper intended to remind them exactly why accountability mattered, not just for today, but for every day moving forward. The arrival of the man in the neatly pressed suit sent ripples through the already tense atmosphere. As he stepped inside the house, his presence demanded attention. The officers, who had been so confident just moments ago, suddenly looked uneasy. Their rigid stances softened slightly, and their voices dropped to murmurs as they turned to face him. Mark noticed the change immediately, though he wasn't sure what it meant. Who was this man, and why did the officers seem to shrink under his gaze? "Gentlemen," the man said calmly but firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm Assistant Chief Ramirez. I've been informed of the situation here, and I'd like an explanation, now." His eyes scanned the room, taking in the scattered balloons that had fallen during the chaos, the overturned cane lying near Grandpa Joe, and the worried faces of the Johnson family. The taller officer cleared his throat, clearly flustered. "Sir, we received a report about suspicious activity at this address. We were just doing our job." "Your job?" Assistant Chief Ramirez interrupted, raising an eyebrow. His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Do you consider shoving an elderly man onto steps part of your job? Or barging into a child's birthday party without proper cause?" The officers exchanged a glance, their confidence crumbling further. They began stammering excuses, trying to justify their actions, but Ramirez held up a hand to silence them. "Enough. You will wait outside while I speak with the family. If necessary, internal affairs will be involved." With that, he turned his attention to the Johnsons. His expression softened as he approached Grandpa Joe, who was still seated on the porch steps, clutching his side. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked gently. Grandpa Joe nodded slowly, though his face was pale. "I'll live," he replied, his voice strained but steady. "But I don't understand why this happened. We were just celebrating my granddaughter's birthday." Ramirez frowned deeply, shaking his head. "Neither do I, sir. Not yet. But rest assured we'll get to the bottom of this." He glanced at Mark and Sarah, offering a reassuring nod. "Please tell me everything that happened, from the beginning." As Mark recounted the events, the mysterious knock, the officers' refusal to explain themselves, and the escalating confrontation, Ramirez listened intently, jotting down notes. Every detail seemed to weigh heavier on his shoulders. When Mark described how the officers had treated Grandpa Joe, Ramirez's jaw tightened. It was clear he didn't take the matter lightly. Meanwhile, Justice Harper watched silently from her porch across the street. She noticed the way Ramirez carried himself, not just as a figure of authority, but as someone genuinely disturbed by what he was seeing. Her call had worked. Backup had arrived, and not just any backup. A high-ranking official who understood the gravity of the situation. Still, she knew this was only the beginning. The wheels of justice moved slowly, but they would turn. Back, inside, Ramirez finished speaking with the family and turned to address the guests who had gathered nervously in the backyard. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, raising his voice just enough to be heard over the lingering whispers. "I apologize for the disruption today. This is not how law enforcement should operate, and I assure you, this matter will be thoroughly investigated. Please give the family some space for now. They've been through enough." His words brought a collective sigh of relief from the crowd. Parents ushered their children away from the windows, and conversations began to pick up, again albeit cautiously. The mood was still heavy, but the worst of the storm seemed to have passed. Before leaving, Ramirez knelt beside Grandpa Joe one last time. "Sir," he said quietly, "I can't undo what happened here today, but I promise you, those responsible will answer for their actions. In the meantime, please take care of yourself and let me know if you need anything." Grandpa Joe managed a weak smile. "Thank you," he said simply, his gratitude evident despite his pain. As Ramirez stood and walked back toward the sedan, the Johnsons felt a glimmer of hope returning. The officers lingered awkwardly outside, looking smaller than ever under the weight of scrutiny. Across the street, Justice Harper finally turned, to go back inside, satisfied. For now. She had set something in motion, and she knew the ripple effects would spread far beyond this quiet suburban neighborhood. Whatever came next, one thing was certain: accountability had arrived. That evening, after the chaos had settled and the last of the guests had gone home, the Johnson family gathered in the living room. The balloons that had once swayed cheerfully in the breeze now lay deflated on the floor, a silent reminder of how quickly joy could turn to turmoil. The house felt quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone is lost in their own thoughts. Grandpa Joe sat gingerly on the couch, his ribs still aching from the earlier incident. Sarah brought him an ice pack wrapped in a towel, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it gently against his side. "I'm so sorry this happened," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't deserve any of it." "Grandpa," Joe gave her a small, reassuring smile. "It's not your fault," he said softly, "and it's not Mia's fault either. Don't let this ruin her day, or yours." His words were meant to comfort, but there was a heaviness behind them, a sadness born of experiences he rarely spoke about. For years he had carried the scars of injustice, not just physical ones, but emotional wounds from battles fought long ago. Today had reopened some of those old memories, but it also stirred something else in him. A quiet determination. Mark paced back and forth near the fireplace, his mind racing, and he kept replaying the events of the afternoon, the officer's aggression, Ramirez's arrival, and the lingering uncertainty about what would happen next. "This can't just end here," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "They can't get away with treating us like this." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Mark hesitated before answering, unsure who it might be. When he opened the door, he found Justice Harper standing there, her presence as commanding as ever. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "I wanted to check on all of you," she said simply, settling into a chair across from Grandpa Joe. Her tone was warm but firm, like someone who cared deeply but wasn't afraid to speak plainly. The family thanked her profusely for intervening earlier, but Justice Harper waved off their gratitude. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We're only at the beginning of this. Those officers won't face consequences unless we push for accountability, and I intend to do exactly that." She went on to explain what she had uncovered so far. After making her call earlier, she had reached out to trusted contacts within law enforcement oversight committees. What they discovered was alarming. The suspicious activity report that had brought the officers to the Johnsons' home was entirely fabricated. A neighbor, someone with a known grudge against the family, had called it in, hoping to disrupt the party. Worse still, initial investigations revealed that the officers involved had a history of misconduct, including multiple complaints from other families in the community. Justice Harper leaned forward, her gaze steady. "This isn't just about today," she said. "It's about every time someone abuses their power and gets away with it, and it's about ensuring that doesn't happen again." Her words struck a chord with Grandpa Joe, whose expression softened as he listened. "You're right," he said quietly. "I never wanted trouble, but maybe it's time I started talking about my own experiences. If sharing my story can help prevent this from happening to another family, then it's worth it." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed his words. For years, Grandpa Joe had kept his pain private, choosing to focus on the good moments instead of dwelling on the bad. But now, sitting among his loved ones, he realized that silence sometimes came at a cost. Maybe speaking up could make a difference not just for his family but for others who had been wronged too. Justice Harper nodded approvingly. "Your voice matters," she told him, "and together, we'll make sure it's heard." By the time she left, the air in the house felt lighter, though the weight of the day lingered. The Johnsons knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since the officers' arrival, they felt a sense of hope. Change was possible, if they were willing to fight for it. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened at Mia's birthday party began to spread far beyond the quiet suburban neighborhood. News outlets picked up on the incident, drawn to the dramatic contrast between a child's celebration and the shocking actions of the officers who disrupted it. Headlines like "Cops Crash Birthday Party Injure Elderly Veteran" and "Justice Served." "Family Speaks Out After Police Misconduct" dominated local news, sparking conversations about accountability and reform. At first, the Johnson family was hesitant to share their story publicly. Mark and Sarah worried about putting Mia in the spotlight, while Grandpa Joe wrestled with his own reluctance to revisit painful memories. But Justice Harper's encouragement and her unwavering belief in the importance of speaking out helped them find the courage to step forward. "This isn't just your story," she reminded them gently. "It's a reflection of something much bigger. Sharing it could help create change." Grandpa Joe became the heart of their message. With Justice Harper by his side, he began attending community forums and speaking at town hall meetings. At first, his voice wavered as he recounted the events of that day, the aggressive behavior of the officers, the pain of being shoved onto the porch steps, and the fear that rippled through his family. But as he spoke more, his words grew stronger, fueled by both anger and hope. He didn't just talk about the party. He shared pieces of his past too, recounting moments when he had witnessed or experienced injustice during his time in the military. "I've seen what happens when people stay silent," he told one audience, his tone firm but compassionate. "And I've learned that silence doesn't protect us, it leaves room for harm to continue. If we want things to change, we have to speak up, even when it's hard." His vulnerability struck a chord with listeners. People connected with his honesty, and soon others began sharing their own stories of interactions with law enforcement gone wrong. Some were similar to the Johnsons' experience, others highlighted different forms of misconduct. Together, these voices formed a chorus demanding action. Meanwhile, investigations into the officers involved revealed troubling patterns. The neighbor who had falsely reported suspicious activity admitted to harboring resentment toward the Johnson family over a property dispute. As for the officers, records showed they had been cited multiple times for using excessive force and failing to follow protocol. Internal Affairs launched a formal inquiry, and within weeks, both men were suspended pending further review. The case gained national attention, drawing commentary from activists, lawmakers, and even late-night talk show hosts. Clips of Grandpa Joe's speeches went viral online, earning him praise as a symbol of resilience and integrity. For Mia, whose birthday had started so joyfully, only to end in turmoil, the whirlwind of media coverage was overwhelming, but also strangely empowering. She saw how her grandfather's bravery inspired others, and she began to understand that even difficult experiences could lead to positive outcomes. Justice Harper continued to play a key role, using her influence to push for systemic changes. She worked closely with local officials to draft new policies aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within law enforcement. Training programs were revamped, oversight committees strengthened, and channels for reporting misconduct made more accessible to the public. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress, and progress felt good. As the dust began to settle, the Johnson family found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened. The scars remained, both physical and emotional, but so did a renewed sense of purpose. They had faced adversity together, and in doing so, they had discovered strength they didn't know they had. And though the journey ahead would still require effort, they took solace in knowing they weren't alone. Across the country, people were listening and beginning to act. Change, however slow, was coming. Months later, the Johnson family decided it was time to gather again, not for a birthday party this time, but for a barbecue to celebrate how far they'd come. The backyard looked different now, with fresh flowers planted along the fence and new decorations hanging from the trees. It was as if the space itself had healed alongside the family. The air smelled of grilled burgers and sweet corn, and laughter once again filled the yard, though it carried a deeper meaning than before. Grandpa Joe sat on the porch, his cane resting beside him, watching the scene unfold with a contented smile. His ribs no longer ached, and while the memory of that painful day lingered, it no longer felt like a weight pressing down on him. Instead, it reminded him of what they had accomplished together. When Justice Harper arrived, carrying a plate of homemade cookies, she greeted him warmly. "You look good," she said, her voice soft but approving. "I'm proud of you." "Thank you," Grandpa Joe replied, his eyes twinkling. "But none of this would have happened without your help and theirs." He gestured toward Mark, Sarah, and Mia, who were busy setting up games for the kids. Over the past few months, the entire family had grown closer, united by their shared determination to make a difference. Even Mia had found her own way to contribute, drawing pictures of justice-themed superheroes that became a hit at community events. The officers involved in the incident hadn't returned to duty. Their suspension had turned into termination after investigations confirmed a pattern of misconduct stretching back years. The neighbor who had falsely reported the suspicious activity faced charges for filing a false police report. While these outcomes brought some closure, the Johnsons knew the real victory lay in the changes sparked by their courage. New policies were being implemented across the precinct, including mandatory de-escalation training and stricter accountability measures. Community forums hosted by Justice Harper and other advocates continued to draw crowds eager to learn and engage. As the afternoon wore on, neighbors stopped by to join the celebration, many bringing dishes to share. Some had attended the town halls where Grandpa Joe spoke, inspired by his words and actions. Others simply wanted to thank the family for standing up when it mattered most. The atmosphere was warm and hopeful, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the neighborhood months earlier. At one point, Justice Harper stood near the grill, raising her glass of lemonade in a quiet toast. "To resilience," she said, her gaze sweeping over the group, "and to the power of speaking truth when it's needed most." Everyone cheered, lifting their glasses in response. For a moment, the world felt lighter, as though the shadows cast by that fateful day had finally lifted. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon and fireflies began to dance in the twilight, Grandpa Joe leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes briefly. He thought about all they had endured, the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, but also the triumphs. They had turned a moment of injustice into an opportunity for growth and change, not just for themselves, but for others too. Mia ran up to him then, tugging at his sleeve. "Grandpa, come play with us," she pleaded, holding out a glow stick necklace she'd made. He chuckled, accepting the gift and slipping it around his neck. "All right, kiddo," he said, pushing himself slowly to his feet. "But don't expect me to keep up with you youngsters." As he joined the game of tag, Underway in the yard, Justice Harper watched from across the street, her arms crossed and a small smile playing on her lips. She didn't need to be part of the festivities to feel their impact. Across the road, her house stood quiet, but inside she kept clippings of news articles and photos from the events that followed the party. They served as reminders of what could be achieved when people refused to stay silent. That night, as the stars blinked overhead, the Johnsons gathered around the fire pit, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. There was still work to be done. Justice was never truly finished. But tonight they allowed themselves to rest. Tomorrow, they would continue fighting for a better future. But for now, surrounded by love and light, they let the warmth of hope carry them forward, knowing they had already changed the world in their own small yet meaningful way.